tonight, I want to introduce my good friend and my mentor, Dr. Katie Filan. She's going to lead us in a discussion tonight about biodiversity. In my mind, Katie is one of those very rare and wonderful combinations of skills and talents. She's a conservation biologist, she's a tropical ecologist, she's a primatologist, she's a researcher, and somehow she packages that all into this wonderful role as an educator and a science communicator. It's just been an absolute joy to have her thought leadership with the Morpho Institute, and she's done a lot of work with us on how to be more effective in conservation engagement, both with US educators and with our partners in the field. Her work has spanned continents and species, and a whole realm of things, from environmental education with the Peace Corps in Paraguay, studying white-faced capuchins in Costa Rica, mentoring Peruvian students in field stations in tropical ecology and conservation and primatology. She's researched 7 primate species in Indonesia and Borneo. And here at home, she even engages communities in conversations about climate change through the arts. She is currently a teaching assistant professor at Miami University in their biology department, as well as on faculty for their master's program, Project Dragonfly, that focuses on inquiry and conservation. And I actually got to know Katie as a late stage grad student. She was one of my professors, and that quickly devolved into a partnership and a collaboration. And we had to agree that I would not be able to take courses from her anymore because I wanted to rope her into my world in this work in the Amazon. So she's just fantastic, and I'm just really happy to introduce her to all of you tonight. And I'm with that going to stop sharing my screen, Katie, and turn it over to you.
Thanks, Krista, for that wonderful and kind introduction. And I didn't put her up to saying any of that, even though I'll pass my 20 later on. So I am so full of gratitude to be here. I always really enjoy talking to the educators at the Morpho Institute. It's one of my favorite activities. And thinking about what I wanted to talk about today, we're doing maybe a little bit of a different sort of conversation tonight. We are going to be talking about conserving biodiversity, but I'm going to approach it as sort of a master's class in step 1 of, I want to actually conserve biodiversity. What do I need to do, and how do we do this, and what are some of the resources that are available for you all to be conservationists in your own neighborhood, but also how to bring this into the classroom. And so just a couple of quick notes for those of you that know me well. I love having an engaged classroom, so feel free to put questions in the chat. Feel free to unmute if you would like to. We're going to have some interactive ideas. I'd love to have your ideas in this, because the interesting and exciting thing about conservation is that there isn't a right answer. And so we need all these different voices. Before we get started in the official presentation, I do want to acknowledge where we are. And so I am currently part of Miami University and here in Oxford, Ohio. And so Miami University is located within the traditional homelands of the Miami and the Shawnee people, who, along with other indigenous groups, ceded these lands to the United States in the first Treaty of Greensville in 1795. The Miami people, whose name our university carries, were forcibly removed from their homelands in 1846. In 1972, a relationship between Miami University and the Miami Tribe of Oklahoma began and evolved into a reciprocal partnership, including the creation of the Miami Center at Miami University in 2001. The work of the Miami Center serves the Miami Tribes community and is dedicated to the revitalization of Miami language and culture and to restoring that knowledge to the Miami people. Miami University and Tribe are proud of this work and the more than 140 Miami students who have attended Miami since 1991 to the Miami Heritage Awards program. And on that, I also need to acknowledge both our partners in Peru, the Mayahuna, and all the other stewards of the original stewards of the land. And so before we get into the content, I just want you to also look at this picture. For those of you that have been fortunate enough to travel with us to the Amazon, just take yourself back into that place. Be present in this moment. Think of what that felt like. What were you feeling? The sounds, the smells, the humidity, the bugs. And for those of you that haven't joined us yet, just have this as a preview of what we hope we will continue to be able to see. And so that's part of what we are going to talk about today. How can we maintain this amazing place for both the present generations and those after us? So why are we talking about conservation today, and how do we conserve biology? And so we need to start with specifically a partnership with Morpho, and that key phrase that we have, and all of us have those on our hats, of Amazon conservation through education. And what does that mean? And so that's such an important part of the work that we do at the Morpho Institute. And so this is hopefully a way of kind of making some of those connections. So when we decided to pick this topic, it was way before I found out that this was perfect timing, that for those of you that follow biodiversity news, in around December 19th, COP15 agreed for the global biodiversity framework. And so this is a large international agreement, all but I believe, and I haven't updated it yet, 2 nations have signed this agreement to really make the conservation of biodiversity important. So I am happy to share with Kristen. She can send out the links to some of the press releases, but there's 4 main goals with 23 different targets. One of the most common ones that has been talked about for a couple of years is the commitment of nations for protecting 30% of the lands by 2030. Another one of them is really reducing food waste, which is a really interesting thing. Happy to talk about those sorts of topics a little bit later. And so why is that important? But a variety of both financial agreements and then different efforts of how are we going to conserve the biodiversity of the planet. And I am going to try to make this an activity that's based on what we can do, and just acknowledging, and I think most of these people in the room recognize that biodiversity is really important, but we are at this very important tipping point. For the first time ever, we are marking a geological time period by our actions, so the Anthropocene. And so this is just such an important time for us to really reflect on what is going on and how we can make a positive change. Okay, so this is where you come in. So I have my ideas, but why should we bring in these topics of conservation into the classroom? And so go ahead and think about that. Feel free to share your ideas in the chat. You can also go ahead and unmute if those of you want to share your voice. I always love hearing other voices.
This is Janet. I'm in the car, so if there's weird knowledge, then I'm sorry. Why should we study conservation? Because we are the only organism that can change its habitat to the point that we can't survive. If we're looking just people-centered, and if we don't conserve, it makes it difficult for us to survive. And then our influence is so far beyond what we need to survive. And so that's like glossing over 1,000,000 steps deep.
I love it, Janet. Thank you so much for sharing. Yes, and so some really important points there, that we have this unique position that we both can negatively and positively impact the biodiversity of the world. We have a lot of notes here on ensuring the future, Great, 100% agree. I'm going to go a step further. And so when I was thinking about what I wanted to talk to you all today and why are we going to cover conservation, and especially from the approach that we're going to cover it. And so conservation is a wicked problem. And so it's not just because I've been talking to my dear friend who lives in Boston, and so I pick up her lingo of using wicked every other time, but this is one of those very complex problems that doesn't have a clear-cut solution. Why is that? Because conservation involves so many different aspects. Many people, I'm officially trained as a biologist, and so I sometimes look at this from the biology standpoint. So is it a biological problem? We use biological information to make a big decision on this, but it's a history problem, it's a culture problem, it's a politics problem, it's an economics problem. And so it really is this complex issue. So therefore, we need systems thinking. And systems thinking, I think, is so important at all levels, from K all the way on. It explains our body, explains our world, explains all these other things. So thinking about these complex cause and effects relationships in our classrooms. On that, I used to do integrated planning, and so I'm a big fan of how do we teach outside of the silos, right? Conservation is a great one. I just did a quick list. I'm sure all of you can think of many more topics that this will connect to. Keep that in the back of your mind as you're listening today. Biology, social studies, history, science, math, reading, art, storytelling, all these can come together, and you can use this regardless of what you're teaching. It's not just a science class idea. Connected to system thinking, I'm going to present a couple of different ideas throughout this, but there isn't a solution. And so really thinking about critical thinking, problem solving, analyzing different risks, decision making, these are skills that are those lifelong skills. And then, as many of you said, in various ways, of the fact that, we are part of this system, we influence the system, and so we impact it and are impacted by it every day. Okay, so more questions. Again, I make you all do the work. Why is biodiversity important? Hear it, think about it. Feel free to give any examples. Why is biodiversity important for you?
I would say that it's got an intrinsic importance. It exists, therefore we don't have a right to cause it to cease existing.
Yeah, great. So intrinsic importance, wonderful. That's also my number one too. Anyone have any reasons why it's important to us? Supports all life, yes.
Well, if we just want to think about us, all the ecosystem services that are interconnected through biodiversity are vastly important. And again, that's a little bit more anthropocentric, but it's fundamental to survival of the systems that we exist in.
Exactly. Yes, so you all hit some of the main ideas of starting with that intrinsic value, this value that is outside of us. And so I love thinking about ethics. It's one of the things that I've enjoyed my side readings, and so where your ethical view is a very interesting way of how you approach these issues. However, we are humans, and so we're living in this human-centered environment, so acknowledging our utilitarian values of it. And so Janet highlighted ecosystem services are things like pollination and oxygen production and filtration of our waterways and our water cycles. All of our goods come from nature, right? We live in houses that are built from these sorts of things. A lot of our power, even if it shouldn't be, is from dead animals that are really, really old. And so acknowledging that part of old extinct biodiversity, we are getting, as a scientist, acknowledging that so much of our information and knowledge comes from these biodiversity centers. Many people have both a spiritual connection to the land, but then also, even if you don't have a spiritual sense, there have been numerous studies on just showing a picture of nature can calm us down. And so I start my lectures with pictures of biodiversity. If you can get children and students outside, even better. So lots of different reasons from there. My grad students don't like when I talk about the economic reasons of biodiversity, but I think it's utterly important because we live in humans in these complex economic societies. So many of our decisions are connected to that. So therefore, we should be part of this conversation. And so just pulled a couple of different things. So we started talking about ecosystem services. Costanza did a classic study. It's now over 25 years old. At the time, he estimated 33 trillion dollars per year of ecosystem services. They updated that in 2017 to $148 trillion. I can't even imagine that number. And we can then look at these things of what happens when we don't have these biodiversity. So destroying biodiversity, Bloomberg said $2.7 trillion a year. And connected to this biodiversity loss, connected with other environmental problems such as climate change, we have up to 18 weather disasters in the US that are over $1 billion. So I just tried to see if they finalized 2022. My thoughts go up to those in Buffalo. So obviously, I think they were at they hadn't quite finished out how many they had finished, but we are currently experiencing this. Those of you that are on the West Coast, I know that you're being hit by a big storm right now as well. So, and then as we are still cycling through a global pandemic, a healthy planet, healthy biodiversity also connects to our people, both in thinking about these increases to zoonotic diseases, but so many other factors of our health, from environmental health, respiratory issues, to chronic diseases, all connected to connecting that biodiversity and that intact ecosystem, and then how that impacts us personally. Okay, so thinking about these terms, this lecture is on conservation. Nice seeing Kathy on there because we had this conversation in the Amazon this summer. Conservation, preservation, sustainability. We hear these words all the time. What are these definitions? How do you think of these words? Feel free to write things in the chat if you want to. If not, think about how would you define these words? Are they different? Are they the same? Can they be used interchangeably? Also, fun fact, not related to this. I just went to a teaching conference that said that just pausing increases content retainment. So just a fun fact for those of you that may not have known that, but you all know this. Okay, so for the sake of time, I have in the back of my bookshelf, I think I have about 20 different books on environmental biology, conservation, and many other conservation, strategic planning, etc. None of them actually had a definition of conservation in them. And I was like, interesting. So it's a term that we just assume that everyone knows, and we don't actually need to define it. Now, I'm going to talk about preservation first. In common terms, we oftentimes see these interchangeably, but preservation is usually a way of maintaining biodiversity where we separate it from humans. And so on the extreme example, we are excluding humans from that area and saying, this is a place that we are trying to make it untouched. Conservation is intertwined with humans. And I would say that conservation is a strategy used to prevent the extinction of biodiversity. And I would then say that the way that we do that is through sustainability and thinking about the idea that sustainability in the definition. I know we probably have some APES instructors in the class, the 3 E's. So economics, ethics, and the environment. Ethics are oftentimes, with my undergrads, just call it people. And so how do we use these 3 systems in a way that we don't need to continually putting new inputs into it and continue to use the same activity over and over again? And so for me, that idea of conservation is intrinsically tied to human use. And humans are connected as part of this conservation. So in my line of work, I use the social ecological systems model. So thinking about those systems again, and how do we, although humans are part of the system, we have all these different factors that make us slightly different. We make laws, we have this economy, this complex global economy, these national economies, we have politics. I saw that Kathy mentioned talking about politicians in there. And so how do we talk about these decision makers and put them in this system? And so in my line of work, I need to think about the biological and ecological systems and how they intersect with these human systems so that we can both understand the threats to these systems, but then also think about these as solutions. So for those of you that like some other visualizations, this is saying basically the same thing, but this intersection is both, again, things like climate change and invasive species and habitat loss, but also the positive of how do we find and connect these 2 systems to really make sustainable and conserve these important biodiversity systems. And so throw this in here. Was fun going through all of some of my pictures of projects that I have personally worked on. Some of you have seen some of these systems of conservation doesn't happen without people. If anyone is trying to do conservation without people, they're probably not actually doing conservation. And I'll let you kind of understand there's a nuance in that statement that it can work both ways, right? We could maybe argue that we don't need conservation without humans, but also we are very much part of this solution as well. Okay, so a little bit of doom and gloom. So for the next sort of section, I'm going to use this from the idea of resources that are available on the web. Okay, so I pulled everything from the IUCN Red List. So this is the International Union of Conservation of Nature. Scientists, policymakers around the world have this huge database. It's accessible to everyone. And so it's kind of the gold standard, international standard of how we talk through these. We can talk through some of the interesting ideas of what this list means as well. But as of yesterday, 42,000, more than 42,000 species are threatened with extinction, okay? This varies across taxonomic groups, but is of all living things. You know, Rob's in the crowd, so we have to make sure that this acknowledges not just plants or animals, but also our plants. And this is of the species that have been assessed, and also acknowledging the species that may not have been recorded by scientists. And so acknowledging that a lot of the biodiversity is known to the local communities in there, but science hasn't recorded it yet. And so a little bit of sort of doom and gloom, 41% of amphibians Mammals, 27%. As a primatologist, I think we have 60% of our primates currently threatened with extinction as well. Okay, so major threats to biodiversity. What are they? Wow, numbers are sobering, but we're gonna hope to have some hope.
Humans.
Humans, yes. Habitat loss. Habitat fragmentation, yes. Climate change, of course. F5. Pollution, yes. And I didn't even give Kristen my slides before the presentation. So over harvesting, I think you just got them all. Extraction of our natural ideas. Pollution. Changes in land and sea use. So that's where we're connecting our habitat loss and fragmentation, also our habitat degradation. Exotic or invasive species, so species that are coming in from other areas. Invasive species provide both an economic and an ecological threat, and climate change. And so these are the big five. They interact, they're complex. Humans are obviously underlining a lot of them. IUCN goes a step further and adds a couple of other ones of these threats to biodiversity. I think a lot in threats, and then how do we find solutions to minimize those threats? And so geological events in there, some specific sort of ways that we have habitat degradation, so transportation and services, agriculture use. In the Amazon, can anyone name some of the threats that we are seeing to our biodiversity? Both specific or general. Agriculture, yes, conversion of agriculture land. Logging, yes. Climate change, very much so. Gold mining, yes. Yeah, so we have a lot of these different threats, and we see them at very different degrees. Connected to climate change, we also have fires. And road building, yes, very important one, especially for the areas that we work, and other mineral extraction. So when we think about these threats, where do we group fires? So fires usually lead to habitat loss. And so habitat loss and fragmentation, and then we can think about the why as well. Great question. Yeah. So like to divide these ideas into direct threats. Yeah, root cause is deforestation. So we have these direct things. If I'm looking at a primate species and say, why are the numbers reducing? I can say, well, they're being overhunted in an unsustainable way. And so that is their direct threat. I might say they are losing their food sources and their sleep sites. And so that is habitat loss. That is their direct threat. Now, this is why I think kids are some of the best scientists and also the best problem solvers. So this is why I want to present this all to you so you can bring it to your classroom and find better solutions. They are excellent at asking the why question, right? And so to really make change, we need to look at those direct threats. We have to take it a step further, and we have to ask why. Why do we see pollution? Why do we see unsustainable hunting? Why do we see habitat loss? And so then I call these indirect threats, these underlining larger scale factors that are answering these why questions. And this is not an extensive list, but just kind of thinking through these things. If we want to make long-term sustainable solutions, we can't just address the direct threat. We have to get to the root cause. Also great when you think about behavioral management in your classroom. What is the true cause of those sorts of issues? So economic instability, globalization is definitely a big factor in that. Really important when we talk about these global issues. What is our role in it? Where are our food sources coming from? Where are the impacts of our greenhouse gases? Human population growth. I know this is a very interesting one. So acknowledging that population growth by itself isn't necessarily our biggest factor, but definitely something to consider. Unsustainable economic growth. Most of our economic systems are built in a system that needs growth. What does that mean? What does that mean for our natural resource use? Corruption, lack of government, and also, something as potential simple as lack of information and understanding of sorts of these issues. Okay, so once we have sort of the threats, usually we have to start out with what do we want to save first. And so I'm primarily a speciesist. However, I understand that these changes need to happen at a larger scale. And so, do we save a population? Do we save a species? Do we save landscapes? And so I became a primatologist, for those of you that don't know my backstation, because we have this connection to primates. And so we can use these as then symbols to save these larger systems. I also love dung beetles, so I don't know why people aren't saving dung beetles just as their own, but oftentimes sexy monkey species will save all of our really cool invertebrates and our plants, even though I think those things should be saved. This is one of those activities where it's great to have debates in your classroom of what should we save and why. And so, do we save things that are highly impacted by humans? Those species that are on the edge of extinction due to our impact? Or do we save things that are of lower impact, right? And so there is a debate paper that we should not focus on hotspots, these places with high endemic species and high threats, but instead cold spots because they're cheaper to save, right? So places that are probably okay, they're intact, let's just block them out. We can, on the same sort of vein, do we save those species? We have some species around that have less than 20 individuals left. So we will need to really protect those to save those species. Should we focus on that? Or should we save those species that have a pretty good population? Could do a couple of small things, but they have a lot of that genetic diversity already built in. Again, specialists versus generalists. You can think of this as biodiversity uniqueness as well. One of my favorite species is the eye, which lives in Madagascar. It's got this crazy finger. It is the only species of its entire family. Then we have things like TD monkeys, which are also super cool. Obviously, you all know how much I love listening to the TD monkeys in the morning, but very, very speciose. Maybe 36 species, maybe 50 species. I know it's one of your favorite questions when you're in the Amazon with me. Hey, what species the TD monkey is that? I'm like, depends on what side of the river we're at. It's maybe 1 of 5. So which of those do then we want to focus our priorities on? If we lose one of the TD monkey species, is it important? Is it that important? Really important sort of questions. And then connected with that, I'm an evolutionary biologist, so thinking about these also through an evolutionary standpoint. So species that have been around for 400 million years, or things that have only been around for 5 to 10 million years. Okay, so question for you all. I didn't make an official poll, so you'll just have to mark it in the chat. What percentage of species in the Amazon are endangered or critically endangered according to the IUCN? So your choices are A, 75, B, 50, C, 20, D, less than 5.
I feel like this is a trick question.
I would never do a trick question.
Oh, yikes.
Me
Oh
too.
no, a couple of you all know me too well. So we're getting some B's, we have some A's, we have 1 C. Anyone gonna vote for D? C with a caveat. Okay. Oh, Lindsay's going in with the A. Okay. So now I pulled these data myself. So there's a margin of error, but we have potentially, Pam knows, Pam's there. We potentially have less than 3% of species in the Amazon that are either rated as critically endangered or endangered. Why? Anyone, does that blow anyone's ideas a little bit? Are they like,
That's where my caveat came in, Katie.
Jordan, I see you unmuted. Do you have thoughts?
I would also say it's probably because we just don't know that much about the species that are there.
Okay, so we don't know. Okay, definitely a hypothesis. Strong hypothesis. Anything else we know about the Amazon? And again, this number changes a little bit depending on how carefully I draw my, the Amazon basin is a little bit, what watersheds I'm including. So extreme levels of diversity, extreme levels of species, information about those species definitely influence this. However, there is actually a factor on this that's really important. In the Amazon, we obviously have very important and very diverse populations of humans. However, the extent of human impact and population densities of humans are much lower in the Amazon compared to many of the other ecological systems in the world. And so the Amazon is actually not a biodiversity hotspot, in the idea that hotspots are both threatened and have high levels of species diversity and endemism. And so comparing that to where I work in Brazil, which is the Atlantic forest, there's only 2% of the Atlantic forest currently remained. And so the number of species that are critically endangered and endangered much higher. We are on the edge of Rio de Janeiro, so giant population center. So it's just something to kind of think about our preconceived notions on this. Okay,
Katie,
so
can I ask a question though? About
yeah,
is that, to me, that feels like that's kind, and rightly so, from a very like pan Amazon basin vantage point. You start drilling down into smaller ecosystems and smaller spaces, then that whole thing could change dramatically.
yes,
Okay.
yes, and Janet just put that. It can change so quickly. Yes, 100%. And this is not to say it's fine, we don't need to think about this. This is just to think about some of those threats, think about the extent of it. I did this both in sort of our area that we work in the Napo and the Amazon, and then I extended out. The level and refinery of this data is very coarse. But once I extended it out, especially to those eastern side of Brazil that was hit a lot by those fires a couple of years ago, these numbers changed drastically. So yes, all very, very important caveats on that. Okay, quick, I'll just go through these really quick for the sake of time. And so, the criteria that we used for a species to go extinct, I play these tricks with my undergrads as well. I put up a couple of species. I'm happy to share this activity with you. I pull data from all of them, and then I have them rank both their criteria that they would use to conserve a species and then how they would assign it. Because some of this is pretty straightforward. There's a lot of also really interesting statistics of in situations of what is included versus what's not. For example, all the great apes are currently critically endangered. Most of their populations are over at least 100,000. Don't quote me on that one. But critically endangered, just so that you have sort of that framework and numbers going forward. Population reduction is greater than 90%. This is bringing in both Janet and Krista's idea that we can have a population that is currently looking good with high numbers. If we see an event that drastically reduces that number, it can become critically endangered very quickly. Small geographic range, small population size, declines, so less than 250 individuals, and then very small or restricted population. So under 50 individuals, that's where I start thinking a lot about genetic diversity. Things that are not included on this list. So all those factors that the biologists love to think about, they're not on there. Life history traits, reproductive numbers, lifespan, all these things. Some of that is incorporated in the quantitative analysis. And so these are mathematical models that you can throw in all these different factors to see how much of a species is at risk. And so, species that reproduces often will be able to recover much more quickly than a species that's very slow-lived, reproduces very few offspring in a year. Okay, so let's go, and we're going to conserve a species. So we're going to think through this. I went through and roughly highlighted, I went a little bit outside of Peru, some of these areas here, and pulled down the list of data. This is all available. You can pull it out in this format. You can download Excel sheets, so great way to bring these ideas into your classroom, have students do active learning. And so as you can see in bringing in some of those caveats, if we look at some of the, and this isn't a complete list, but a lot of these species are of least concern here. We have a couple vulnerable here. But if you notice, we have two things that for me are concerning. We see a lot of populations decreasing. We see a lot of populations that we don't know what's going on with them. And so really kind of thinking about, okay, how do we feel about that 2% that are critically endangered, right? Do we feel good about that or not? Also really important idea. We have a lot of species that are data deficient. We don't know enough about them, about their range, about their numbers to even say any sort of classification of them. Threats, we've talked a lot about these, but again, you can pull this information from it. A lot of sort of small scale conversion of habitat. We have unsustainable hunting of these. And I just want to really emphasize that it's unsustainable versus sustainable hunting. Those make such a big difference on sort of these conversations. Hunting is a great matter of using those resources. It's that unsustainable hunting that can really have an impact on these species. The thing that we didn't mention that's on this list that maybe should be, but road construction and what that impact that's going to be. So I pulled some endangered species in this area. Anyone notice anything about these species? We have a giant otter, 2 species of spider monkeys, one of our river dolphins, curassows. Large-bodied animals, potentially. Yeah, higher level on the food chain as well. So as our example, I of course picked the monkey. So white-bellied spider monkey. Have any of you seen a white-bellied spider monkey while we've been in the Amazon? Yeah, I know. As a primatologist, I'm a sucker for megafauna. We should ask Pam if Pam has ever seen a white-bellied spider monkey. Or Kathy's been in the Amazon for many, many times. So in our area, we don't see spider monkeys. I probably would fall off the canopy if I saw one. And so much like the threats, we have habitat loss. 35 years, yeah, 35 years we haven't seen a spider monkey. And so all this information is publicly available. You can go through and look through these threats. And then there's a larger expansive detail of all this information. And so in the Loreto area, which is where the Morpho does its work, we think that they haven't been seen in a long time. And this is connected with frequent hunting connected to illegal logging activities. And so many of you have probably heard some of these stories from the Maihuna as they shared about the time with the timber extraction and a lot of the activities that were going on in that area. Okay, so if those were the threats, what would you do to save this species? You are in charge of conserving the spider monkey. What would you do? Any ideas? Education, where there's hunting in the community. Okay, we need some information of where they are. So I actually didn't make an answer to this because these things are really complex. I just pulled this example out. But yes, acknowledging Indigenous leadership and knowledge systems. What do they know? How have they lived with time immemorial with these species? What are the different ideas of sustainable hunting? It could be habitat preservation as well, thinking about what land we need to use, in what ways, how do we set it up? Get some government involved in there, thinking about those ideas. Yeah, so super high level, just threw in some of those classic use strategies. I think one of the things that are great is that conservation should be really specialized, and so really thinking outside the group. This is why I love doing these activities with kids, because they think of things that we always are like, oh, that's never going to work. And oh, we always do this. And so it's always just great bringing in these different ideas. But some sort of classic strategies that are used are protected areas. Protected areas aren't necessarily preservation. So there's a lot of mixed use ideas, having local communities decide and think about how they want to use their resources. Interesting idea of tragedy of the commons is primarily a Western perspective, assuming that all commons will be overused, and that's not necessarily true. Education is really important, especially with some of these ideas of hunting. I work with a lot of primate species that are part of the illegal pet trade. And so just thinking that these would be great pets. And so I'm constantly having this conversation with friends saying, hey, actually don't share that video of the chimpanzee on the bicycle, because that's actually leading to the species being endangered in the wild. We can think about, if we think about those deeper indirect issues, there are some of these that are connected with economic issues. And so thinking about how we can bring finances in that then have alternative uses of the land, so that we don't need to have high levels of extractive resources. And so beekeeping, ecotourism, one of those. And then at some levels, we need to think about ways that we are going to actually restore or bring in some of these ideas. So restoration of areas, you can also have some really interesting agroforestry techniques and reintroduction. So sometimes when those populations are very low, translocating those animals or bringing them in from managed care. And so I just wanted to highlight this. This is a classic scientist idea of let's put an overly complicated figure in there. So I have to have at least one of these, but this is the conservation plan of the golden lion tamarins. And so one of the reasons I highlight them, although they're not in the Amazon, they're one of the conservation success stories. The population was down to 200. They're now over close to about 4,000. And so this is their conservation plan. And just a couple of things to highlight that their goal is to both save the golden lion tamarins and the forest, but with these broader human-focused goals of that this will lead to not only a healthy ecosystem, but jobs, housing security, and health of the local people, but also the ecosystem. Here are all the different threats that they have identified, and they have complex result chains that then connect to different strategies. So they actually have 13 different strategies, and then those steps of how this is actually going to make a difference on it. And so again, those illegal pet trade, the education program starts with the kids. Local community members say, okay, nope, we're not going to have golden line tamarins as pets. And then how that then changes the populations on various levels. They have some interesting forest protection, what parts of the lands, having certain parcels of lands protected, certain parcels of lands that then are used. So just showing you how complex this can get, but also that we need a variety of different solutions. Okay. So I want to acknowledge this, that we have amazing conservation partners. Obviously, the Mayahuna are stewards of the land. And so if you haven't, I just want to highlight The Guardians of the Forest, which is a great film that talks about some of their current struggles and really listening to how they're conserving their lands. And we want to acknowledge our partners with Conopec, working with local communities, also the work of Explorama and having that land of the areas in a way that is then conserved so that we can have these populations being able to be conserved in the long run. And obviously in Morpho Institute and bringing these education stories both on the local level and also the global level. And so in 7 minutes, I'm going to finish my backyard conservation. And so I'm going to tell you an embarrassing story. I was actually in Malaysia and I did my dissertation work on the island of Borneo. And so I can tell you almost every endangered species on that island, right? So I was interviewed and then we were talking about orangutans and we were talking about all the endangered primates and the endangered plants. And then they look at me and they're like, what are your endangered species in your country? I had recently moved from Florida to Ohio and I'm like, I don't know the endangered species in my own backyard. And then came home and obviously quickly researched that. I did get the piping plover, so was able to mention a couple of them. Our sea turtles are endangered, but really important to think about what are the endangered species in our backyard. So I'm in Ohio. We have critically endangered bumblebee species. We have a couple more of these, but just wanted to highlight a couple of them. Interestingly, if you look at the US, Randy puts a nod to the American Bury beetle, yes. And so right now, currently, if you do broad scale pictures from the IUCN information, do you want to guess what the #1 threat for endangered species are in the US? Invasive species. And so thinking about what actions we can actually take, and we have a couple of our ash trees here. And so a lot of these invasive species are things that we can actually manage in our own backyards, in our schoolyards, in the forests, in areas around there. I know East Coast people, you have the lantern fly, and so there's a big squash campaign going on. I have tons of honeysuckle that I'm constantly fighting. And so thinking about some of these actions that we can take here in the Midwest or also around the United States to minimize both the spread of invasive species, but then also reduce some of those threats. Just wanted to show some other resources. And so this is US Fish and Wildlife. Another fun activity is actually comparing endangered species lists from the state level, the federal level, and the international level. They don't all line up. And so very interesting thinking about home range sizes, population, species level. So very interesting sort of ideas of sort of thinking about those critical species lists. So what does this look like in your classroom? I have a couple of these activities written up, so I'm happy to share them with Krista, and Krista can share them out to the Morpho community. But where do you and your students fit into the conservation? And so feel free to list any ideas. I think it's always important to both acknowledge our resources. And so there's some great Morpho lesson plans on analyzing your breakfast and where that comes from. Yes, so we'll do that. Instilling these ethics, very, very important. Thinking about how we can lower our environmental impacts. And so I love to do this with my undergrads. They count how many water bottles they use in a week, and then their goal by the end of the semester is to at least reduce them. I think last semester we reduced water bottle consumption by 10,000. I only have 100 students in my class. Really kind of connecting, great telling these stories of the Amazon and some of these endangered species around the world, but also bringing it back to our own neighborhoods. And so what can we do? I used to work with a pollination biologist. I was saving habitat of endangered primate species. He was saving habitat of endangered butterfly species. He got to plant a couple of gardens and he's like, I'm done. And I'm like, I have 100 hectares of forest to figure out how to plant and fund. And so you can make some of these small scale differences in really important habitat for some of these critically endangered species, just planting some plants in your backyard. Connecting with local and international ideas, and then thinking about these issues from a large systems approach. And so what are our actions here in the US and how do they impact them? I threw in food waste. I like to keep things in the inquiry and open, but food waste is one of the most impactful things we can do to reduce climate change. And it doesn't cost anything. It actually saves us money. And it's something that we can all do. And so just a really nice, interesting way of thinking of this. And so it was really interesting that the biodiversity plan actually talked about food waste. Yeah, exactly. And so really thinking about these ideas. Sorry, reading a chat from Janet about intact systems actually save money. Very, very important points. And then it's really important to share stories of hope. We will make a difference if we think that our actions actually can make a difference, especially with kids, balancing those messages and showing them that they can make a difference can be very, very impactful. And so this is one of my students who's making a pollinator garden. These are some of the pictures from one of my art activities with middle school students. And so thinking of how they're expressing what's going on and they're being advocates for their own local environment. I wanted to, I'll type these out and share them, but just a couple of resources. There's so many great resources that are real data that you can bring into your classroom. One of my favorite is Global Forest Watch. They take all the satellite data, put them in interactive ways. You can look at forest loss, forest regrowth around the world, fires, looking at different industries. They have palm oil on there now. I think they have mining on there. They're always adding new things. Current conservation is connecting conservation stories to art. And so they have these beautiful articles. They also have a kids section. And so really sort of bringing in those messages that are designed for kids. This is just another protectedplanet.net looking at this goal of 30-30. What percentage of our land is protected? Where is that? How can we advocate for some of those sustainable issues? Yeah, got another great issue, Amazon to the Andes maps. So we'll put those all together. And then I'm 1 minute over, but for every complex problem, there's an answer that is clear, simple, and wrong. And so I just love this to challenge some of these preconceived notions that these are simple solutions, but really to think about these broader systems and ideas. So I'll stay on for a little bit if Krista allows me to answer any questions, but I really want to just thank you for your time, put a pitch into some of the work that we're doing to sort of monitor some of these biodiversity numbers and species, and so that we can have better data to make better decisions on all this. So again, I appreciate you taking the time on this Thursday evening to talk with me and learn a little bit about conservation.
So Katie, thank you. First off, wow, what a wonderful overview of big ideas and complex problems, and just giving us a chance to think about all of this. I will collate everything and we'll share some resources out. I just want to say that the work that we've been so fortunate to do in the Amazon with the Maya Huna is really reflective of what Katie was talking about. And it's just such a privilege to be at the table working on some of those projects with the Maya Huna and our other partners. So it's been quite a gift to all of us to have the privilege to do that work and to have Katie be on board and help us make some of that happen. So questions, I'll shut up now. Katie, go ahead and field some questions. If anybody has any, we can stay on for just a little bit.
Yeah, and Krista, thank you for highlighting those points. And these are complex issues that need complex players on complex different ideas. And so how do we form these partnerships that we really can have these solutions are really important.
Yeah, anybody have questions or comments? Please feel free. It's a small group. Go ahead and unmute and just fire away.
Yeah, I was just, Pamela was just connecting with the conservation director at the Detroit Zoo, talking about those. Great. Well, I will put my email, and it will be shared in the resources in the chat. So if anything comes up, as an introvert, I always have questions after I log off. But I want to thank you all again, and hopefully we will see each other all soon.
Thank you, Katie. This was outstanding. And I can't say enough about the AIP program and the faculty like Katie. It was an amazing graduate experience, and I just got so much out of it. And one of my biggest takeaways that still lingers, one of the assignments, I don't think it was an assignment that you gave, Katie, but we had to come up with our personal sort of conservation project for one of the classes, and I decided that I would just monitor in my garage all the plastic that entered our house, and I kept it for a month, and I still cannot unsee that. And it took that, even for me who works in this field, to visualize that impact that just two of us, our kids are grown, were having, and that plastic was going to outlive me generationally. And it was sitting there in my garage, and that was for a month, not a lifetime. So yeah, it was an amazing experience. So thank you for that too, Katie, and for the work that you do with Dragonfly and everything else. So, all right, everybody, Happy New Year, onward to 2023. And so looking forward to seeing so many of you in the Amazon, and we'll be missing some of you, looking at you, Jordan. But I know you'll be back. So thanks so much, everybody. Talk to y'all soon. Thanks, Katie.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.